Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
Hello. On today's episode, we have somatic coach B. Join us for a conversation all about politicized healing under racial capitalism. Together, we talk about healing our shame, the construction of the self, and boundaries as an invitation to more rather than less. Thank you, B, for sharing all of your wisdom about connecting to our bodies and the importance of tuning into our somatic experience. That is absolutely crucial to being able to be in good relationship with other people. The reality is our emotions are embodied. They come up through the body, and we're able to process, feel them, express them through the body. And so it is so important to be honoring that practice of tuning in. One of the things that B talked about is just starting with your feet. Can I invite you right now to feel your feet in your body and to start there? It can start with just little things like that. And also, I want to give a huge shout out to one of our new Patreons on the Modern Anarchy Patreon, Waveland14. Thank you so much for supporting the long-term sustainability of this podcast and keeping it free for all the listeners. I appreciate you and welcome you into the community. And I know for all of you out there, supporting the podcast through Patreon might not be financially feasible, and that is totally okay. There is so much power that we can do with just sending this podcast to one person, right? We talked about on this episode today about the power of generational love to make ripples and actually change society. And just thinking about even one person, if each of you listeners thought about one person to text this podcast to, it would spread like wildfire. Just one person. So yeah, if supporting the Patreon account is not possible for you, I just want to invite you to send this podcast to someone that you love, that you think would benefit from it, that you think is a fellow anarchist that is questioning the status quo and living to the beat of their own drum. All of y'all are welcome here, and I appreciate all of you listeners that are tuning in each week and are sending me DMs sharing how this podcast has moved you and inspired you. I appreciate all of your messages of love and support, because this podcast is a lot to make. I'm not going to lie, as a doctoral student balancing all of this is a lot to make, but y'all keep coming back each week, and I made a promise that if one person tunes in each week, I will keep doing this. So you are that special someone, dear listener, if you are hearing this message, and I appreciate you dearly. I hope that you were inspired by today's conversation, and y'all, tune in.
Let's just dive in then.
Let's dive in, yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, what you're passionate about. You can answer that really in any way.
Yeah. Well, I'm B. I use they, them pronouns. And I think like where I really situate myself more than anything right now is really in this realm of being a somatic coach and facilitator and teacher. And I situate that in a broader context of politicized healing, which to me is really healing that is about all of us getting free and really increasing our collective capacity for freedom. It's like really like what is the healing that serves our movements and is going to allow our movements to really create lasting change. So that's my passion. That's like my 24/7. That's my life, in many ways. And when I'm not doing those things, it's like I really value my relationships, my friends, my family, my animals. I train a martial art, Muay Thai, which is like amazing and so informs the work that I do. Yeah, I'll start there. I think that's me in a nutshell.
And that sounds like very meaningful work to be bringing that somatic healing to the collective humanity at a larger scale. I would love to hear, because I'm vibing with you, right? What are we healing from? What is the situation?
Yeah, great question. what are we healing from? It's like, what are we healing towards? Like those
Mm.
questions feel really, really tied up with one another. It's like, I don't feel like I can talk about one without talking about the other. And I think, it's like no surprise. I mean, the basic answer is we're healing from racial capitalism and all of its impacts and all of the ways that it takes away our choice, our agency, collectively, individually, all of it, all of the very real material impacts of this system
Mhm.
called racial capitalism on the lives of people and on the planet too, right? And so, when I really feel into like, then what are we healing towards? And like, why do I do this work? Or like, what is so compelling? It's like, well, we're like, what freedom means to me is choice and really getting to feel and know choice, not just like as an idea, but really fundamentally as a embodied
Oof.
knowing. It's like
Yeah.
I get to choose. And to me that means really that we are available for taking action towards what we care about under pressure. Like
Mm.
under the pressures of our normal lives, under the pressures as things get more pressurified, as they definitely are inside of this world, especially in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure that is trying to take away choice and actively is taking away choice from many people, right? So to step into imagine a new future, a new direction that we're moving into can be really powerful.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
100.
Yeah. Could you say more then on like what is that choice? What does that look like and how that's connected to somatic work?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's like, I think we're, especially those of us who are really justice loving people, we get really good at identifying, like, yes, this is like how racial capitalism, this is how white supremacy, like externally, is really impacting me.
Yeah.
It's like, this is how it's impacting, incarceration rates. This is how it's impacting, our ability to take care of ourselves with food, it's how it's affecting our capacity to have affordable housing, like all of these things that are like really material. And then, of course, like there's also stuff that and I think is more mainstream and becoming more mainstream is like the effects and impacts on relationships, right? Yeah, of racial capitalism and white supremacy. And I think, really what somatics has to say too is that, like, yes, all of those things, of course, matter. And then there is this shaping on a very, like, cellular body level and an impact of on a very cellular body level
Yeah.
of how these systems impact us. So, for instance, like I'm mixed race and
Mhm.
I'm queer and I grew up pretty working class and I grew up around a lot of white folks. And one thing that I really learned very early on was that I had to make myself, one, as small as
Mm.
possible, and that two, I really had to like hustle to belong. And so, like the shape of my body was one where like my chest was kind of like pulled
Mm.
back and I was like a little like this. And my voice was like constricted,
Oof. Yeah.
and that was a really, really, really smart shape. But what it didn't let me have is very much safety. It didn't let me have very much belonging or
Mm.
dignity,
Mm.
I was trying to take care of a lot, right? And so, when I started on my healing path, it's like, okay, more and more once those things got really attended to, it's like, oh, okay, like the body can actually open up. The body, like the
Yeah.
chest, doesn't hold that same contraction anymore, right?
Mm.
It's like the voice actually got to lower and fill out a little more.
Yeah.
So when I talk about choice, this is like my own personal example here, but it's like on a very cellular level, we hold these things. And then when we heal, when we transform, either individually or in community, whatever that looks like, it's like those same shapes, those
Mhm.
same embodied knowings, those same smart things that once took care of us but don't anymore, those just get to be different, you know? And so, you know, from this place in my body, and this will be like a lifelong unlearning, right?
Right.
But it's like, yeah, I just kind of know that I belong in a very different way than I used
Yes.
to, right?
Yes.
And, you know, I'm in this perpetual project of trying to unlearn overwork
Mm.
and unlearn that hustle to belong type piece. And so it's just really different. So it's like going from one set of like embodied possibilities to another set of embodied possibilities that is
Mm-hmm.
really more in line with what I care about, what we care about.
Yeah.
That's choice. That's choice.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it makes so much sense that the body would even cave inward to protect when all of these systems of oppression are out impacting you, right? To then naturally in your body curve in more for protection, like on a biological evolution level. I mean, things like the body keeps the score, all this stuff starts to come up in my head of the ways that our body holds on to trauma and how there's so much healing that can occur through that journey of reconnecting with your body. And like you said, that then affects your relationships. Because when you're coming in like, you know, hunched over and feeling small, how then can you connect with another person when that's your experience in your body, right? So like you said, this affects multiple levels of our whole existence here.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or how can you even like dare to want anything in
Mm.
relationship, you know,
Oof.
from that place, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is that something that you felt in your own experience?
Oh, totally. Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think, you know, inside of that hiding away from me, there was a lot like inside of my somatic healing around finally owning my queerness.
Oof.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and my non-binariness, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and
Mm-hmm.
really being like, oh yeah, actually like I don't have to hide this part of myself. I can again like dare to really be
Mm.
who I am
Yes.
because
Yes.
I don't have to, yeah, I'm not having to bend to this narrow vision of who it was that I grew up with and who I had to be to survive in that environment, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, if you're willing to share, I would love to hear more about your journey in that to embracing your
Yeah,
non-binariness and your queerness.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think where I'll just start is like, you know, from the place of that really like pulled in self,
Right.
there's a lot of shame that
Mm.
really ruled that shape. And you know, shame is really smart. Like shame being that like kind of that last line of defense for our nervous systems under like really, really extreme threat of like, let me put this message of you're wrong into your body so you don't have to feel like the really intense annihilation or terror or rage or whatever it is that's like those huge, huge feelings
Mm.
that are just part of like really, really extreme experiences, sometimes known as trauma. So I walked around with a lot of that. You know,
Mm.
I walked around with a lot of shame of really feeling like I was not enough and I was too much at the same time.
Mm.
And so, you know, I think like so many folks, it's like we grow up without, I grew up without very many models of queerness. I actually grew up very religious,
Wow.
evangelical, and yeah,
Mhm.
and
Yeah, how was
yeah,
that? How was that?
yeah, actually, I have a really good experience with church because
Okay,
I
good.
got out at a moment when I was like, I think I knew I was queer. I was
Ooh.
like 16
Ooh.
and I was like, I don't really believe in this anymore. And luckily, no one in my family really rejected me or did
Good,
anything weird with me. So I actually have a fine experience with that.
good.
I mean, I'm not an evangelical Christian, obviously, but you know, like the bond that I had with my grandma and that, and like I went to an all black church, so being connected to
Mm.
my blackness inside of that. I mean, there's just a lot that was positive, and I like, thank goodness for this body that was like, you got to get out of here
Mm.
before it becomes toxic or before it becomes not serving, you know.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
but yeah, so that was my environment, right? Like I had no, I had no models of queerness. And I grew up in just like this like cookie cutter ass place,
Mm.
mostly white too. Yeah, yeah, as I said. And like middle class, and my family was more working class. So this was like a lot of not belonging that happened, or a lot of difference that was there.
Mm.
And I think there was just like a real, like, well, people are straight. People are straight. This is what you do. You just like have this boyfriend thing,
Mm.
and this is what you do. So that's what I did, that's what I did until really when I left to go to college, and I was like, oh, there's queer people. There we go. There we go. There we
Mm.
go.
Mm.
And even then, it was like a long journey of really being like, yes, this is who I am. And I think it just took a lot of that shame healing to finally be like, well, this is who I'm going to be in the world, like in a daily way. And I'm going to really claim
Mm.
my queerness. I identify as queer, but like, I might say like I'm bisexual too. I don't really, that's not like a label I prefer. But I think there's just a lot of biphobia inside this world too, right? It just so happened that my first relationships were mostly with cis men, and
Mm.
it's really changed now in my life. But yeah, I think for a lot of folks, especially young folks who don't have those models for queerness, and they do realize that they're queer, and then they're dating cis men, and they're like denying who they are because of that. I'm like, no, girl, come on, just like claim your queerness,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think, and then a lot of societal messages will be even pushing that like if you're not, if you're dating a opposite gendered person, like that you're not queer in your identity if you're not also dating other people of the same gender, right? Like
Right.
so much of that pushing too, of like this performative nature that you have to be enacting it for it to be an actual identity, and which is just all part of this system of continued shame, right? Some people feeling like, oh, I'm not
Mhm.
queer enough unless I'm dating someone of the same sex, or gender.
Yeah.
Like the levels of shame in all of these pieces are just so vast. And I think when you think about shame, like one of the scary things is feeling like there's something wrong with you, and then the disconnect that creates with your other relationships, of feeling like I'm not worthy of connection because of this thing about me, and how that really affects us on a deep psychological level. I think shame is one of the worst things to experience in terms of how it makes you feel so isolated.
Yep. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. I mean, it limits so much. How much shit gets perpetuated from a place of shame, It's like people that act out probably I mean, that's like what all right-wing fascist ideology is based off of, is a profound level of shame,
Right.
And then I think for folks who are have more marginalized experiences, it's like the things that we don't do, the things that we
Mhm.
don't let ourselves have because of
Mhm.
shame,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and you spoke to another like important piece of this too, of having role models in your community that are modeling these different identities, these different facets. When we don't, this is another reason why representation of different minorities is so important, because there is no example of how to do this. And so then you're left like grappling, looking for narratives of how to be in the world with quite literally no examples of that.
Totally. Yes. Yes, and I mean, I'll just say representation and visibility is also, it's a double-edged sword in many
Mm.
ways, right? It's like it's incredibly important. And it's just like if queerness is a way that people live, then it needs to be like the queerness just needs to be part of the narrative, which queerness is a way that people live, so it needs to be part of the narrative, just like, if blackness is how people live, which it is, then blackness needs to be part of the cultural narrative, right?
Mhm.
Because it will authentically reflect like who exists, right? But yeah, I mean, I think in some ways though too, it's like the more representation that exists, the more that these identity categories also become more fixed and
Mm.
can impact belonging, and can impact belonging in a negative way too, because there
Mm.
becomes this ideal that ultimately can end up serving, racial capital itself too sometimes, right? Like
Yeah.
homonormativity, gay
Mm,
marriage, for instance, right?
mm, mm,
Or like respectability inside of blackness, for instance, right?
yeah, like feeling like there's this box that you have to fit into that's then modeled, like that double-edgedness of that.
Hmm. I mean, one of the great things about being like a mixed race person
Mm-hmm.
and like a queer person and a non-binary person and someone who has like a very mixed class experience too is just like I grew up never fitting into literally any box. And I think that that has felt really, it felt really torturous for me at
Mm,
times growing up, especially, which for all the reasons that I already named. And, I think like now I don't really have too many desires to be fit into any of those boxes. I don't really have too many. It's like every identity that I have, it's like, well, how can queerness be more of a verb than a noun, inside of my life? It's like, how can non-binary be more of a verb than a noun too? It's like things we do rather than things we are or I am in a fixed way.
hell yeah. Hell yes. Absolutely. Yeah. It's more of, like you said, exactly a verb. I would love to hear your experience with your non-binary journey as well and coming into that, if you'd be willing to share.
Sure. Yeah. I think I mean, this is the same with queerness with me too. I was never like super tortured about any of these things. It's kind of like that thing I said earlier about like just that intuition when I was 16. And I mean, I remember what sparked it. There was a girl in one of my classes and I was like, oh my God. Anyway, and I was like, I think there's something here. And that's what sparked the church thing. And then, it was kind of there inside my consciousness. And I think like once I was around people who were using that sort of language, I was just like, oh, okay, this is kind of just river that I'm flowing in. And I feel like similarly with non-binariness, like never really had much of like a difficult relationship with that. It's just
Mm,
like, you know what? Like there is something about my gender that is more expansive than what I've been given as a as a model of what it means to be a woman, which I don't identify. I feel fine with the label girl in many ways, but I don't identify as a woman. And I think, also just to be like a non-binary femme person, gender changes so much, which
mm,
is so cool
yeah.
too. Prior to the pandemic, I was like, very like high femme person. And I was like, my gender is femme. And that is and it is it is my non-binary gender is femme. And femme is this queer gender for me. It's this queer experience for me. And now, like I'm like back into my Muay Thai. I watch sports. Like I'm wearing flats all the time. I mean, I'm wearing lipstick right now, but it's like not the stay on matte, bright red kind that I used to always wear. I have to wear a baseball hat. I mean, like, I just like rock the LHB look a lot of the time, long hair butch look, and I'd say to my partner, I'm like, man, I have like 3 pairs of Birkenstocks now that I never thought I would,
Yeah.
at this stage in the pandemic. So I'd say to my partner, like, did you ever think you'd be in a relationship with a LHB when you hooked up with me, 5.5 years ago? And they're like, no, but it's great. And I'm like, okay, cool. Gender fucking changes because I never thought, this would be my gender. I'm like a femme bro now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And holding the space for all of that, right? And all of that being you. And yes.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And I guess it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with, there's dysphoria that happens
Mm,
and there's like the realities of, like to top surgery or not top surgery and, to bind and when to not and things like that. But mostly it's just like, yeah, gender it feels like a place just to express and to move and to just let
mm,
myself be more than
mm-hmm.
anything.
Yeah, which is so beautiful. And I'm hearing such this space of expansion to be all of yourself and not have to feel like you fit into any sort of mold and to feel like there's space for all of your being in the beautiful way that it is.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I just really like wanna, yeah, shout out to the Gen Z folks because, like they're the ones really living up the gender expansiveness for real and being amazing models for me and everybody else. Because like I don't know, I first started looking at top surgery options like maybe like 6 years ago,
Hmm.
and there was no one who looked like me who I could ever see that had top surgery. And now there's just like so many different versions of top surgery that meet so many different folks' needs for gender affirming surgery. And I'm just like, damn, like this has blown up in the best fucking way, you know?
Yeah, I have a lot of hope for humanity because of the expansiveness and all the questioning and the space that the younger generations are creating for themselves and all of that as like a collective movement. There seems, I mean, I didn't even know these potentials for my own experience when I was their age, right? Like I have a lot of hope that we're going in a positive direction when we're creating this level of space for the diversity of the human experience.
If we can tune it into some material changes, that will really be the kicker though, you know?
Right, right, right. And how do we do that? Do you have any ideas?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a big question,
I
you
know,
know.
I love big
I mean, and
questions.
yeah, no, that's great. Me too. Me too. I'm all about them. Somatics loves those
Oh
big,
yeah.
big questions too. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like one of the things like why visibility or why
Mm,
representation is also a trap because sometimes it's like more and more of us can be brought into the fold of capitalism, right? And our identities can begin to become commodified and things like that. But then it's like still, people are paid, like people can't afford the rent, people can't afford food, we have horrible health care, all of these like things that really are making material impacts in people's lives, they don't change. And, it's like arguably, I don't want to dismiss, like, there's also huge mental health impacts of not being accepted for who one is, or having a literal ban on your body,
mm,
as is more and more common across this whole country now. So I just want to say that. And then I think like I don't really have one path, and I think anyone who says they have one path, we need to really be looking at that, and
mhm,
like, what's that about? I do think there are like core competencies, I'm going to call them. That's very much a somatics word, that are largely missing from
mm,
people, um, that I think really prevent us from getting to where we're
mm.
going. And so, like, I grew up as an organizer. That's like really how I was politicized. So
Cool.
I was politicized in the wake of the Iraq War and, did a lot of organizing and do a lot of organizing. And really was politicized in that anti-war movement. And there's like a very like in the process of being politicized, there's a very like clear path based off of an orientation, a political orientation that I have. And I think like now more than ever, the thing that is so clear is that there actually isn't a clear path forward. So,
Mm,
it's like and I think we saw that after 2020, and it's like that was such a beautiful uprising. It was amazing. It was, I felt like I had trained for the last 10 years to be a part of it.
yeah.
And it's like kind of the same old stuff happens
Oof.
inside these uprisings. It's like things get co-opted. There's infighting that happens, right? It's like state violence and repression just like go up, up, up and escalate. And so when I say there's like these core competencies that are kind of missing, it's like, what are the things that like don't that get in the way of our movements winning, right? And what I'd say is one is shame. And like really again, what do people do and not do in the name of shame. Like, how does
Yeah.
shame limit possibility? How does shame impact violence? Gender-based violence, sexual violence, all kinds of violence. And how does shame really impact supremacy of all kinds too, right? So, really being able to deal with that on an individual and collective level. And then I would say the capacity to really hold contradiction, which is something that, you have to have a lot of like internal sense of yourself or sense of being part of a collective in order to really be able to hold complexity and contradiction. It's like our world often asks us to like collapse things into one way or the other, right? But it's like if we can widen out into being able to hold more and more, and that doesn't mean we don't have standards or values or things that are non-negotiables or like lines that do not get crossed. This is my line,
Yeah.
but it means that we can hold the complexity of like what it might actually take in order to get us to where we're going. Yeah. And then I would also just lastly say that I think that that has a lot to do with really our capacity to hold boundaries, and not in this like base way or superficial way, but in a really profound way of like everything that is deeply interconnected, and there is a me, there is a you, there is a us, and like where is the line at any given time? And then how do I really use a no or a decline or a yes as a starting point, right? As a starting point for connection, as a starting point for action to be taken, right? So it's like if I say a no, I'm inevitably saying yes to something else and really feeling for that. So boundaries as an invitation into more rather than less. I'm sure there's more I could say about that, but I would say like these competencies, and that's why I do somatics. It's like somatics really gives us an actual path to be able to grow these capacities and these competencies. And so if we don't know how revolution is going to look, which I don't think we do anymore, there's no little red book that's guiding most of us anymore. And unfortunately, those who are guided by those things are living in other centuries, unfortunately, right now. I'm not saying that they aren't useful tools. We need to look to revolutions of the past, but they're also revolutions of the past, right? Yeah. So if we don't have this political program of how to move forward, then it probably just means we need to learn how to be together more, right? And so it's like we need to be open to possibility. We need to be open to relationship and open to figuring it out as these like ruptures like 2020 happen, so that we can keep figuring out how to hold open the space that these ruptures create rather than collapsing back into, what racial capital wants us to do, fight, repress, all of these things, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm thinking about how much of this is all collective, right? A community-based thing. I think I study relational cultural theory in psychology, which talks a lot about how like our concept of self is shaped by all the relationships that you have. And so, yeah, when you think about that, and if we expand that out, like knowing that like all of us are really being affected by all the other relationships that we all have collectively, which just kind of makes sense on some level, right? Like I am a product of my family dynamics and the school dynamics and whatever else out in the world. And like in that level, sometimes I hear some of the Buddhist teachings of like we are all one, in that way of thinking of like, oh yeah, so far psychology is based on all of these relationships. We are somehow all kind of one in that way, that like collectively we all influence each other really in like really big ways. And I think a lot of what you're saying is so key to relationships too, right? Of holding complexity. Every single dynamic, even this dynamic that we're having right here, like you're having an experience of me and I'm having an experience of you, and neither one of those is the capital T truth of what this experience is. We're each going to have our own experience, and like taking that into our relationships and being able to hold space when someone has an experience of you that is different than yours, and instead of getting defensive and all of that, to like hold space for that complexity in that. And also kind of like you said, I loved what you said about boundaries being an invitation for more rather than less, right? By stepping into your own values and knowing where your line is, you're inviting people for deeper connection because you know your line, rather than it being blurry and feeling frustrated or resentful about people stepping over. In that communication, we're actually bringing people so much closer.
Yeah, yeah, that quote from Princess and Phil, right? Which is, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me both at the same time.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And then to know that that's how we can connect more rather than like stepping on each other's toes in that. I think there's a lot of difficulty in that, though, at the same time, of being selfish or too self-centered, right? There's a lot of messages, at least from my own experience, of people pleasing, where you're just like, yeah, let me just like completely like melt into everything that you need because I'm not important,
Mhm.
right? And like that whole system, I always relate it to the putting your mask on yourself first on the plane, right? The plane's going down, you got to put your oxygen mask on first before you help someone else, right? Like if you're that, completely people pleasing and bending to everything, like who are you and when does your cup get filled up, right?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Also, just really being with the reality of what people pleasing or
Mhm.
appeasing takes care of for folks too, right?
Yeah.
Like it does take care of so much. And I think there's this tendency when we're learning about boundaries, when we're healing from anything, that we go to the extreme and we
Mm,
go to the other side. And so that's really why I name, and neither side is like the center. Neither
right.
side is actually the thing, neither extreme. And so when I was talking about like kind of this like gross form of boundaries, right? It's like the extreme, like individualism, nothing, just take care of yourself, right? Just say no, like self-care, all of that. Like that's not the type of boundaries we want either. And that's not
Mhm.
actually what we
Mhm.
mean. We mean something very different. We mean like,
Mhm.
again, that profound respect of the relationship between you, me, us.
Right, right, right. And even like challenging that idea of like the concept of self, right? To some degree, that's a really big Western colonial idea that came into psychology that other cultures don't have. And I
Yeah,
personally challenge, right? Like, what is the self? Who is really an island by themselves? I think of Wilson, the movie, what happens when you're really on an island by yourself? We go mad. Like we are social creatures. Like that is just not part of our nature. So, yeah, but so much of our society really teaches that you need to figure out who you are. You need to be alone to figure out who you are. And like some of that I understand, like spending time with yourself to feel your own rhythms, but truly, like, we are a collective species, like, and you are who you are through all these relationships that you have that shape you.
totally. Yep, I feel you on that. It's like the construction of the self, right? And like that divide between subject and object, all of that, that is such a product of capitalism itself, right? And so, one version of the world that I want to live in, one definition that I use is like we will really have liberation when there is like not that need for the divide between subject and object, when there is no longer this compulsory or enforced divide between public private,
Yeah.
when our capacity to reproduce ourselves and take care of ourselves and each other isn't tied to doing or performing or
Mm.
labor, that which is external. So, yeah, I'm right there with you on that one. Glad
Mm.
to hear it. Yeah,
Yeah,
so much,
absolutely.
yeah, so much harm done in the name of the self. And it doesn't mean we don't have this body, right? That
Right.
is our body, but it's just like all of the discourse around that, right? All of the weaponizing of this individual self, right?
Which is like you said, great for capitalism because I'm going to sell you what you need to figure out your identity. This is what you need. This. Let me sell you this because this is who you are. Like it's a great tool for capitalism. I
Oh,
love it. Yeah.
totally, right? Yeah, I mean, like,
Yeah.
look at TikTok. I
Mm.
mean, talk about manufactured wants, you know? I don't know what your feed is like, but it's like when I go on TikTok and it just feeds me like aesthetic thing after aesthetic thing. It's like, wow, this is really creating a whole psyche. It's like creating a whole want that
Mhm.
was never there
Mm.
before. Would I have not gone on to TikTok, right? And so just think about that happening on a mass
Yeah.
scale. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to think how that's like a relationship in and of itself, right? Like your relationship to TikTok and then how that like shapes your psyche in through that by giving you and interacting with you in unique ways. Yeah.
Hmm.
Scary, that power at times.
Totally. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
just like the reality that like people like make their whole livelihoods, which like good for them for like being in the hustle, but like, making TikToks and about Amazon purchases and then,
Wow.
linking them and then people buy their stuff and they get the affiliate kickback or
Interesting.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wild.
For my
Wild.
own mental health, I have not gone on TikTok yet. So I
Good for
keep, it
you.
feels like a drug from what I hear with everyone. So I'm like, I don't know if I want to open that container.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't open it. Don't
But that's
open it.
crazy. That's crazy to think about. Yeah, and how that's influencing other people. I mean, we need people in that space that are saying the right things, that are moving in the right
Right.
direction too, because that's also such a powerful way to get to like a larger audience. So like hopefully we have, powerful people in there that are using that power for good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Anyway, just pointing out, like, yes, like the billions of dollars that are extracted from us, out of our sense of lack that capital is creating itself, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because you are the objects you buy. That is like such a really big like piece of this. But yeah, I was thinking too about we talk at least in psychology a lot about generational trauma, right? About how things can be passed down, maybe through epigenetics, other sort of stuff, and also just this reality that like the conditioning of, even family, larger systems, but family as an example, right? When there's a lot of abuse and trauma that passes to the next generation because that's kind of what's normalized in that same way, and that affects them, the child of that dynamic in their future romantic relationships, friendships, how that really affects all of it. And I think in the same way that we understand generational trauma, it's also, this is going to sound hippie woo woo, and I'm here for it, but like love will also ripple through society in the same way, in this kind of like infinite ripple, in the same way that generational trauma destroys and hurts and can create so much pain. Love can have the same effect, right? Like
Mhm.
both are true. And so like I like to come into that space of thinking about love, of how when you change on a smaller scale one relationship and then they go out and change all their other relationships at that expansion of love and it keeps rippling out. I mean, that gives me a lot of hope for how we can maybe get to a better space in that rippling out.
Yeah, our nervous systems, yes, like there are things called mirror neurons. Like we really feed off of each other. We learn from each other, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's like in the somatics that I teach and practice, a lot of times we'll use this example when we're feeling into like what we care about. We'll use
Mm.
this example of Malcolm X, and we'll look at the movie with Denzel Washington, and there's this scene in this movie, but we could see this anytime. You can see this in many places in our lives where there's just been a riot and the police have come and beaten lots of folks. And one of the brothers is he's jailed and he's beaten really badly without
Mm.
medical attention. And Denzel Washington goes, or Malcolm X, excuse me, but the actor Denzel Washington
Mhm.
goes to the precinct and demands that he be released. You can find the clip on YouTube. It's
Yeah.
there for folks, and you can just see in his face. You can see in his whole body. It's like, this is what I care about. This is what I stand for. This is what I will not allow to happen anymore. And so, yes, like I would call that love too. It's like love that is like
Yes.
deeply fierce for his people, for our people. And yeah, like one person's body, and then you can see all of the folks around him who are so deeply impacted by that. And ultimately they get him released, right? And so a lot of times it just really takes one person or a couple people like really standing up or moving
Mm.
forward, moving up, entering in order to really shift conditions. And we need more and more of us to do that. But like the actions of a couple folks, they do have ripple effects and they make more and more possible for more and more of us. And so, that's just what we need. That's what we
Yes.
truly, truly need. I agree with you 100%. It's like,
Yes.
yes, trauma is transmittable, but also healing is transmittable. Love is transmittable, liberation is transmittable. All of these like missing competencies that I named, those are transmittable through bodies, through bodies.
Yeah. And I think it's hard depending on what frame and perspective we have when we see all of the pain and all of the difficulties in our society to not feel completely overwhelmed by that and to feel completely powerless, right? When these systems are so large, it's like, fuck, like, do I just give up because I can't change that? And like remembering that, yes, even on this small scale, that is huge to be working even just on a one-on-one dynamic in the ways like we're saying that ripples out. And so in that, having hope for the potential to change and all of this and not getting so overwhelmed by truly the atrocities that still go on every day.
Yeah, I mean, I also will say, like, I don't feel particularly hopeful, and I don't mean that
Mm,
in a negative way either.
yeah,
I feel realistic. I also don't feel hopeless, though.
yeah.
But what I do feel like is very sure of pieces that are probably necessary, the ones I already spoke, for us to really shift things and turn them around. And because I've like practiced all those things in my body and practiced them with groups of people and
Mhm.
know that it's possible, that means I know that it's possible for a lot of us to have them. I know it's possible. I never doubt that it's possible. It's just
Right.
like, is it likely,
Mm.
in this lifetime right now? I mean, we are
Right.
not in a good position, so I don't want to be Pollyanna-y,
Yeah, I hear you.
in this
Yeah, I hear
moment.
you. Yeah.
I have serious doubts about I mean I folks already are so impacted by climate change, for instance,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And we will be more and more impacted. And
Yep.
yeah, what I do think though, and what I do know is that it is our relationships that will 100% be what makes it possible for us to continue to survive on this earth if we are meant to survive on this earth,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes. I appreciate you saying that too, not to be too Pollyanna about it, because you're very right. Yeah, having like a realistic approach to both the potential and the realities, especially like you said in our lifetime. I don't know if we're gonna see that. And then thinking about the future generations that are going to survive or try to survive, right? The effects
Yeah.
of all of our mistakes that we've made living on this planet. It's very scary and sad to think about. And like you said, that first step of connecting with your own body is so important to then be able to connect with other people. For the listener who's connecting with you and thinking about their relationship to their body, is there anything that you would invite them to try to begin practicing to maybe begin that practice of connecting to their body?
Yeah. I mean, I think like a couple things. One, it's like, what is important to
Mm,
you about connecting to your body? Like, what is your why inside of that? Because as we know, the world has really oftentimes made us very separate from our bodies or has really taught us that our bodies are unsafe places to be.
mhm.
And so we really want to have a reason of like, this is what is important. This is what matters to me about this. Sometimes we can also be with like, what has been the cost of me being disconnected from my
Mm,
body, actually? And oftentimes, like take your time to name that for yourself and really be with that question. But oftentimes it's like the cost is that we haven't got to really move towards what we care about. We haven't got to really speak up for ourselves or other people. Just to go back to my own example with that like pulled back chest, really tight shape
mhm.
inside my own self, which was so disconnected from body. I didn't really know that's how I was moving around the world, right? I felt very deep inside myself. It was like I didn't get to be very known to the world. I kept who I really was and like what my real opinions were. I just kept them all very, very tightly shut
Mm.
inside myself. And so that was the cost for me, as an example. Right. So that's step one. You know, it's like, what is the reason? And then, I'll just say this to everyone, and this really is like instructed from my experience in Muay Thai, my martial art. It's like the body is actually the safest place to be, even when it feels unsafe. Because the body is the place where we can take action from. And, inside of our experiences of trauma and oppression, that's actually what gets violated is our capacity to take action, right? And so, it's like the Muay Thai thing is like we always want to move forward. We're always moving forward. We're always moving towards the pressure, not away. And if we develop those skills to move towards the pressure into our body, it's like if we're away from our body, it just means like we can have all kinds of stuff done to us. The translation to Muay Thai is like if we're further away from our opponent, they have a lot of more room to get momentum to punch or kick us,
Wow. Yeah.
And so if like we're outside of our body or not, we're not really moving from the place of our bodies. Same thing. We just have there's just a lot more that will be done to us. It's how we keep our objectified self in many ways. So, and it might feel very uncomfortable. And the goal of embodiment is not to feel comfortable. It's to feel alive. Let's repeat that again. The goal of embodiment is not to feel comfortable. It's to feel alive. And, it's just like, I want to be alive, and I want all of us to be alive at all costs, actually, because that's what racial capital is trying to take away is our aliveness. So it's like knowing, yes, this will be uncomfortable to live inside of here at times. The other thing I'll say is that there's no 100% being embodied. There's no perfection inside of embodiment. It's just like, how do we come back over and over and over again to the life of our body, like knowing that the body is a home that we get to live in, that will always be available. Will always be available. And we make it more available the more time we spend inside, right? And then very practically, I'll say, just feel your feet. Start with feeling your feet if you have them on the ground. Feel your butt in the chair, or on the ground or whatever. Just feel what is underneath you. And that is really what I recommend. It's like, can you feel like letting yourself notice that there is actually something that you are making contact with, and then you can start to feel for your own edges of your body. That is oftentimes like the simplest path in. It's the simplest path into the body. It's like, what is holding me, and where am I making contact with something else? What are the edges of me doing? And then we develop capacity to stay with ourselves and say like, okay, can I tolerate this sensation? Can I tolerate this sensation then?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And thinking about the points of contact is a great place to like start with that. I appreciated you saying too that it might be uncomfortable, right? When I'm grieving and going through pain and feeling that deep loss in my body and crying, like I wouldn't say that feels super comfortable, but damn, am I alive, right? Like, damn, am I alive in those emotions? And like that's part of the human experience, right? Not speaking to the Pollyanna side that like in our lifetime we're gonna grieve and have loss, and that's part of the experience too, is sitting with that pain in an embodied context, right? And I also appreciated what you said about it being a practice, at least is what I'm hearing, right? Of kind of like with meditation, I teach yoga, right? Like that takes time to develop that skill to be in that relationship with yourself. And the second that you come out of that and then start to say, oh, I messed up and I'm not there and I'm like, bah, and then you start this whole spiral of self-negative talk. You're just going further when we can take a moment to realize this is a practice, and maybe we start connected for 30 seconds and then in certain days maybe then it's a couple of hours, and maybe you go back to 30 seconds and then go back to this, like that is going to be our life's work of being in relationship with ourselves and that lifelong practice of staying connected.
That's right. Yeah. I think our very survival really depends on that. It's like our capacity to grieve collectively, individually, because it's like really a profound acknowledgement of like, this is what life presents us with. This is what life presents us with. So we got to be in reality. We got to face reality in order to actually move towards more of us being free. for all of
Yeah.
us being free.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm always studying pleasure, so I'm like, yeah, like how do we get to pleasure? And it's like you can't be fully embodied with pleasure if you're not fully able to go to the same level with the pain. Like that is a
Yep.
both sides of the coin sort of thing. We don't get to choose the feltness, you know. It's you open up to
Yeah.
both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's like one of the best times of my life actually. It was like this time where I had grieved so much.
Mm.
I had grieved so much, and I just felt like it was a moment of huge heartbreak. And then on the other side of it, I just like had the most joyous experience
Mm.
and the most pleasurable experiences probably of like my entire life so far.
Wow.
I just like really got to live inside of so much fun, ease,
Yes.
after
Yes.
that. And it was just like, but I had to be broken open by the grief before that like joy could
Mhm.
really emerge, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Tying back to what you said earlier too about holding space for both sides, right? Yeah, both sides of this coin here of felt embodiedness. I think it's important to talk about because kind of like you said, a lot of people who can just go with the pleasure, 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 and it's like we need to
Yeah.
be talking about both sides of the coin here.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And I haven't said this, but I'm technically trained as a mental health counselor, and I've moved away from that world mostly and
Mm.
in my work, but I come with that history and those liabilities, I'll say too. And one thing, from the psychology world that's so true is just like the insistence on the regulation and the good and the normative versions of of ourselves, right? That are really good for who? Good for capital, right? So, right? Or regulated for who? For
Mm-hmm.
capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like really being inside of this, like, I don't know what's valuable about regulation. What I do think is valuable is choice and the capacity to, because we need, like in this world, let's be really real, like we need our fight response to be able to be on choicefully. We need our flee response, our like avoidance and go away response. We need those things to
Yes.
be on to survive, but we just need to develop more choice around them so that we can also come back to our capacity to take action as well.
Yes, 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 absolutely. We need all those capacities, especially in our current world. That's very spot on. Yes.
Mhm.
I want to hold a little bit of space as we come towards the end of our time. If there's anything lingering for you that maybe we didn't touch today that's still on your heart that you wanted to say, otherwise, I have a closing question I can kind of guide us towards.
I think it's important also to not let the body or embodiment become another checklist. And
Oof.
also, when I talk about these like competencies, it's like those aren't things that are wrong with us. Those are pieces that actually, like, it just feels much better inside of my body to not be moving with shame, but to be moving with dignity. It just gives me a lot of capacity. It's not something to do, it's not another thing to do. It's
Mhm.
like this is the life that I am living, and this is what's possible when we get to live life from the place of our more integrated selves, right? And so, I just don't ever want folks to think like there is one way into the body and this is another thing on a checklist that I
Right.
have to achieve. And it's like, no, no, that's actually not messaging, not shaming around how you aren't embodied.
Mhm.
Those are just messages of systems and they're messages of the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like hearing capitalistic thinking, right? Like that's it's just so
Yes.
we fall into that like I must check this box and if I don't check this box, then I'm not being productive, which means I'm a failure and which means I'm not worthy, which means it's like whoa.
Yep.
And it's just
Yep.
so automatic.
That's right. Yeah. And there's no right way to be inside of a body too. So,
Yeah.
even like folks who are like, well, I'm just really dissociated or I experience a lot of chronic pain, things like that. It's like, well, what really like dissociation, that is a bodily phenomenon, right? So you aren't feeling your body. If you are feeling disconnected from your body, You are arguably feeling your body. Great, cool.
Yeah.
My next question would be, how is it then to feel yourself being
Mm,
disconnected?
mm, mm.
How is it? Like, how are you doing the disconnection? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we just keep moving towards the pressure, right? And there's no right way.
I love that because I can see how a lot of people would be like, you're disconnected, you're failing, versus like, yes, you're connected in that experience of that, and then deepening your connection by exploring that with more curiosity rather than shame, and how curiosity is actually going to bring us into more connection rather than shutting down.
Yep, that's right.
Mm. Well, yeah, if you're feeling good, I have that closing question for us. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question I ask everyone on the podcast is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
I'll go with my first answer, best answer. Everybody is a weird, magical little freak. And everybody is a weird, magical little freak in their own way. And
Yes.
unfortunately or fortunately, in our world, usually only like, depends on, compulsory monogamy and things like this, but maybe like 1 to 3 to 4 other people know about what a weird, magical little freak you are. But like, I really want folks, and what I mean by that is like, everybody has the same ways that are very uniquely expressed about just how weird you are,
Mm.
and they all get expressed in the private of our own homes and with our close people, or maybe just by ourselves, or maybe on the internet, or wherever it is. But we all just have our like absolute zaniness, and like, imagine a world where all of that just actually got to be what was out there in the world. So if you think you're really weird, you are, and literally so is everybody else. And like, even people who you might feel really like distant from, who you don't have anything in common with, I imagine that they are actually very weird too. It's like when I think about some like 70-year-old Republican, I trust that he is actually a magical little weird circus freak too, So, and that's how it is. So if you think you're weird and you feel shameful about it, we're all weird.
Yeah, let that freak flag fly, baby, right? Fly
Absolutely.
high and out in the wind. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Mm. It was such a pleasure to create this conversation with you and to learn from your wisdom and hear from your experience working with the body. I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun to talk. Yeah, and I always love a question where I'm surprised at my answer, and I'm so surprised at my last answer. So I'll go with it. Love that
I
opportunity
love
to
that.
be surprised too.
Exactly. Yes. Is there anywhere you'd want to plug for listeners that are resonating with you and want to learn more about your work and connect with you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram at Hey Have Heart. And my practice and my work is under Have Heart Somatics. I'm around in those places.
Great, great. I'll have those all hyperlinked below so people can just click right into it. So, yeah, thank you again for coming on to the podcast. I really appreciate your time and energy.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a part of the anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.